very first episode of the WiEA Pod. My name is Verona Frankish and I'm the chair of the Women in Estate Agency Board. The Women in Estate Agency community is filled with so many incredible stories from so many incredible people doing so many incredible things. And we are really delighted to bring you a weekly 30-minute chat with so many of the people that make our industry so incredibly special. Each episode will be hosted by a small selection of WiEA hosts, and we will introduce those to you in the coming weeks. In order to create real change in our industry, we genuinely believe that we can only thrive together. And therefore, we will also be inviting a lot of men from our industry to join us to share their stories too. Bringing this pod to life has been a real labour of love, and we've been planning to do this for some time now. And we've only been able to make this happen with the support of our partner, Digital Sparks. If you haven't heard of Digital Sparks, please check them out on Instagram. They're doing some fantastic work on social content for many agents in our sector. So for our very first episode, we have a very special woman joining us today, fresh from the stage at our most recent conference this year. Danni Nash has a really interesting, squiggly career path. From being a sales director at the very young age of 19, progressing through a number of different industries, and now is the managing director of the Property Academy. Danni's journey is a real testament to resilience and courage, and I can't wait to dive into her story. Welcome, Danni Nash.
Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure, Danni, and you did such an amazing job on stage at the conference as our segment on Agents of Change. And when I was watching you on stage, I kept thinking, oh, I want to ask more questions, and it's difficult on stage. So we thought it was a really obvious choice to bring you back and have a proper chat with a coffee and a bit more relaxed environment. Well, I'm not sure it is very relaxed today, but we're going to give it a go.
Absolutely.
So you've described your career on stage and several times when we've spoken as a squiggly career.
Yep.
Was that an intentional choice?
No, it was a complete accident. And I think in a way I was quite lucky because when I left school, I did my A-levels and then I went to art college for a year, but it wasn't as prescribed as it is now where you go to uni. We've almost followed the American model where you do your A-levels and you go to university and that's what happens. Whereas when I left school, we could still leave school at 16, so a load of my friends did, but it wasn't quite as a prescribed route. So I feel, and also we'd all been working since we were 15, so we already had 3 or 4 years under our belt by the time we actually went and embarked on a career.
I think that's a really good point, because you say whenever you start your career at 19 or 21 or whatever age that is, that's the start of your career. But actually, if you've been working in part-time jobs, I worked in a hairdresser when I was 14, I worked in a coffee shop, I worked in a number of part-time jobs. You've actually gained a lot of skills, and part of that is just about building a work ethic as well at an early age. And there's a lot to be said for that. I'm not sure necessarily employers look for that now.
I don't think they do, and I think it's very, very difficult, I think, for teenagers to get a job. But I talked about it on stage. I made a lot of mistakes at 15, 16, 17. So by the time I went and got a real job, if you like, at 19, I'd already learned so much in 4 years of working part-time in some great places. So, my famous example of asking for a pay rise in the middle of reception.
Amazing.
Amazing, but slightly misguided and a little bit overconfident. But I'd done that, so I'd learnt that lesson at 16.
Yeah.
And I think that was a real advantage.
Yeah, and I think, that whole getting things wrong and that concept of you learning much more from failure, even though it's not really a failure, but you're learning those lessons early on. It also helps you to realise that when you've learned the lesson, so the world didn't fall apart. What's the worst that can happen? So allowing yourself to make those mistakes early on is quite useful, I think.
And I think also it's true at people at our age, you don't know what you don't know. And I think 16, 17, 18, 19, you don't really think about the consequences. You just ask a question or you just do a thing.
Yeah.
And then you learn there are consequences, which are generally not that terrible.
Yeah.
But I think the older you get and the more responsibilities you have, there are a lot more consequences to making rash decisions or snap decisions.
Yeah.
And also, you've made a lot of mistakes, so there are fewer to make, hopefully. If you're going through life and you're making mistakes and you're learning, by the time you get to sort of our age, you've made loads of them, so there are fewer left to make.
Yeah, exactly. And what would you say from the kind of going through that career, the squiggly career, what do you think are the biggest takeaways that you've learned from your own path?
One of the big things is I'd be absolutely terrified if I had to go through any sort of formal job application process where I had to produce a CV. And then the other thing is all the skills I've had in every job that I've had and every career that I've been in are the same. So the things I enjoy doing, the things I like doing, the things I'm good at haven't changed.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't go into accountancy because that's just not my bag. But if you look at everything I've done from 15 up to now, it's been talking to people, it's all people based and it's all operations based, because that's the two things that I love. I love working with people and interacting and chatting, and I really like a good system and a good process.
Do you know, I think it's so interesting because I genuinely wish that I'd, I guess, acknowledged and realised much earlier in my career that your day is so much better, your job is so much easier when you're actually doing something that you enjoy. And I think we all, certainly when you're younger, this prescribed career path that we should take, and this need for progression. Oh, when you're successful in this role, in this industry, for example, if you become a very good negotiator, then you should become a valuer. If you're a very good valuer, then you should become a branch manager. And the natural skills for each of those, or the skills for each of those roles, don't necessarily always fit the same profile of individual. And sometimes just being a brilliant negotiator or a brilliant valuer is enough, or maybe go and do that in a bigger organization, or you take the skills that you've learned from that into a different industry. But we're sort of trained or conditioned to think that we have to keep moving through the roles, which isn't always the right thing to do. And therefore we force ourselves to be square pegs sometimes in round holes that are just not fit for us.
And I think it's also incumbent on people that are running businesses or employing people to look at a skill set and recruit on perhaps attitude more than a CV.
Yeah.
Because I've done it just for fun.
Yeah.
Looked at what I'm qualified for, and the answer is not a lot, as it turns, like in terms of formal things.
Sure.
And you look at things on the internet, or you're talking to friends about jobs, and you think, I don't have any of those things that they would be asking for. Yeah. But equally, I've never been out of work since the age of 15, and we get a CV through. And one of the things we've started doing is literally having 10-minute conversations with people if we're recruiting, and they get through to the next round almost based on chemistry.
I always have a chemistry call.
Yeah.
Every single person I've ever hired, I have a chemistry call. Because if I don't want to, that moment when you see someone's name on your phone, and if your gut reaction is, I don't want to have that conversation, don't hire them. And for me, that's a really good kind of litmus test, because you're absolutely right. If you're not going to want to speak to someone on a daily basis, then they're not probably for you.
No, and also it speaks to your point as well, is that there has to be this level of progression. And you think, actually, does there? Because if someone's a really good valuer, for example, what is that skill set? So actually, could they go into a role that isn't valuing, but utilises 80-90% of what they're doing? Do they have the confidence? If you've got the confidence to walk into somebody's house, introduce yourself, walk around their home and have what can often be a difficult conversation, because obviously people's perception of the value of their home is not always a reality.
Yep.
And then work with people to try and sell that asset and get the most money. That's an awful lot of skills in there.
Yeah.
The art of negotiation, you've got to be good at sums, all these things. So actually, what other roles could they fit into, rather than thinking, oh, you've been a valuer, you can only be a valuer, or whatever the next step is on that career rung.
Yeah.
Where else could you fit?
Exactly. And, I think we all have to make those choices throughout our career. So speaking of choices, I guess, you're a mum.
Yep.
And it would be interesting to understand if you've had to make compromises, difficult decisions or choices in your career that you felt that maybe if you weren't a mum or a parent, that you would have had to make? Have you had to be faced with any of those difficult decisions?
Yeah, so when I was pregnant with my first son, I was working for a marketing agency, not Phoenix, one out of the industry, and then they made me redundant when I was on maternity leave, which I was actually quite pleased about because I hated them and had no intention of going back anyway, so it was fine. And then that was when I went back to work for Property Academy. But you naturally have a career break, but at the time our financial situation was such that I had to go back to work quite quickly. So I had 3 months off, but then I was very fortunate in that I went back part-time because I had support from my mum and my aunt. So they had my son for me, absolutely. And then I had my second son, and again I had 3 or 4 months off and went back. But I went back because I wanted to, and I was very fortunate that I could go back part-time so I could do both. I felt like I was there for my sons, and I also felt like I was getting something for me, and also keeping my hand in. Because I think there is a fear that, not for everybody, because some people are happy to have a career break, but for me, there was a fear that if I had a period of time off, I would then become unemployable, or it would be very, very difficult. And in terms of compromise, I definitely think that there was probably a period of 5, 6, 7 years until they kind of were both at school where I was part-time. I wasn't earning the money that I would have been earning had I not had a career break to have children.
And it's such an interesting point, because there's one that unless you're a woman, you don't fully grasp the impact that has on your career. And it's not because of your capability. It's not even because of your willingness to want to come back to work. Because quite often, I often say to my children, I know I'm a better mum because I go to work. And if I didn't go to, for lots of people, that's the right choice. They want to stay at home. I've never had big career breaks when I had my children because I knew I was a better mum because I was doing something for me, for my brain, for my stimulation. But even with doing that, I also, for a number of years, had to make a lot of choices that meant that I wasn't progressing in the same way. And then, of course, that impacts not only your progression that we've talked about, moving up the ladder, but then it's salary progression and everything that goes along with that. So yeah, it is challenging.
And this is what I often wonder, and I don't know the answer, this is just my opinion, but I often wonder when they talk about the gender pay gap.
Yes.
What I think we will never really be able to unpick is how much of it is, I think we are definitely moving closer to equal pay for equal work. But I think what can't be unpicked is women's motivation, like we were just saying. So you and I both wanted to go back to work. I went back part-time. I don't know if you went back.
I did initially, yeah.
Right, and then but some women go back full-time.
Yeah.
And some women don't go back at all, or don't go back for a period of time. So is the gender pay gap a cumulative pay gap over a career? And we chose to go back part-time. And I think that's what they can't unpick is my motivation changed when I had children. In that I didn't really want to go back full time when they were small. And I was lucky enough that I could go back part time. But that was my choice because of hormones and wanting to stare at the baby and all those things. So I think I think the gender pay gap is a very tricky conversation because I think until you can unpick women's motivations and the emotional thing. And again, I've had friends that were absolutely adamant when they had a baby, they were going to go back to work and it wasn't going to affect their lives. Had the baby and just stared at it for 5 years and thought it was all marvellous. And then other women that did the opposite were adamant they weren't going back to work, had 3 months at home with a newborn and thought, this is not for me. I need to go and do something for my brain. And then the other thing I want, I think your children need you less and less as they grow up, or if you're doing it right, hopefully. So it's also about future-proofing your own life.
Yes,
because you think actually, so my sons, whether they go to uni, they go travelling, they leave home at 18, they're going to need me much less until they might have babies, and then all of a sudden I'm very needed again to babysit. But it's like, when you don't need me anymore, what am I going to do?
And we all do this. We're all guilty of attaching our worth to the things that we do. And I did a recent talk at my daughter's school, a career talk. It was about their future. And rather than talking about specific roles or jobs, I was next to a lady who was a surgeon. And she did a very career path. This is how, literally it's laid out for you what your career path is to being a surgeon. Clearly, to my role, not so much. But I talked about its own. One thing is, what do you want to be in terms of what your job is, but who do you want to be? And I talked much more about your mindset and your approach and your work ethic and being willing to fail and listening to the lessons that life is throwing at you. And I think if you focus on just and attach yourself just to what you do as opposed to who you are, then we will all then have that existential crisis when all of a sudden we don't have that job anymore, and I'm no longer a CEO or I'm no longer a chair. Well, what's left behind that? So I've spent a lot of time in my life focusing on what's important to me and my values and my morals and who I am. And I think if we were all kind of focused as rounded individuals, then you're less at risk of that exposure when the whole thing goes pop.
Yeah, and I think the key thing as well is, I don't know about, it's, you're enthusiastic about your career, and work is brilliant.
Yeah, of course.
And I think it's, as a parent, part of my job is to essentially prepare my children so I can drop kick them out the nest at some point, and they're going to go and be decent humans with friends and a social life and who contribute something to society. And again, in my opinion, the fact that I work and I've continued to work, and some of the experiences I've had through work, I can teach them that. Yeah. And also, soldiers watch what their generals do. So my children sit at home and they see me, like this morning, I get up, I get dressed, I do my makeup, and I walk out the door. Oh, what are you doing? I'm going to do a podcast. And I talk to them about it. And it just shows them the possibilities. Yeah. And if they come to me with questions, I'm confident that I can answer those questions because I've had such a varied career. Yeah. So if they come to me when they've got jobs, there's a whole breadth of things that I will be able to confidently answer and help them and guide them with. Yeah. And also it's about that relevance piece. Yeah. Because you can very quickly become irrelevant, especially with everything moving so quickly. Yeah. So all the time we're in it and we're investigating AI, and I'm on podcasts and, we're watching webinars about ChatGPT, and you're keeping up with it. Yeah. You will stay relevant. Yeah, absolutely. And, it is actually quite scary, isn't it? The pace of change now and how things are moving and progressing. And you have to stay relevant. Yep. Otherwise, there's somebody, or something, a bot, coming behind you that's going to replace. And that you can either go one way or the other with that. You can either go down the route of, that'll never last, or the internet will never be a thing, and AI will never be a thing, or you embrace it. Mm-hmm. And I'm definitely of the mindset of embracing new and emerging technologies and ideas, because I have that curiosity and growth mindset, but I think it's really important to keep that. So just going back to your career path, Danni, and some of the things that you've done, one of the themes that I've picked up through your career was the sort of progression and working your way through different organizations, and yes, it was squiggly, but also you progressed. You're now a managing director. Yep. There's not many female MDs in our sector. So what are the traits within you, and what are the things about how you've approached growth as an individual that has led you to where you are now? I don't really know what the magic formula is, but I was thinking about this in preparation for coming today, and thought it was quite interesting because at the health club, I started on reception, ended up a sales director, went to be an apprentice hairdresser, ended up running a 30 grand a week salon back in, 20 odd years ago. So it's a lot in Wimbledon, a lot of money. Left there, went to work for Peter Knight as receptionist, and obviously ended up where I am now. So I thought, there's obviously a theme there, isn't there?
There is,
exactly like you've just said.
Is it ambition? Would you consider yourself an ambitious person?
Yes, but not to the detriment of everything else. Mm-hmm. I am ambitious but I think the ambition comes from wanting to be the best version of yourself. Yes. And I talked at the Women in Estate Agency conference about my desire to learn, and I'm always reading. I'm just consuming content all the time, but I have done since I was a kid.
At the library.
Exactly. So I think the ambition comes from how can I be better, rather than what can I get, or where can I go to. And so I think that how can I be better, the promotions and the career progression is almost a sideline or a side effect of that. And it's
yes.
a bit like,
an unintended consequence
exactly.
almost.
And also doing the work. And there's a lot now about building personal brand, and I understand that, and I understand that it's important. But for me, the whole building the personal brand doesn't come from clever Instagram posts or, constantly tweeting about whatever you're doing. It comes from doing the work and doing what you say you're going to do.
Could not agree more. Yeah, could not agree more.
You turn up, you do what you say you're going to do, you work hard.
Yeah.
You're respectful and you're a decent person, and
consistently as well.
Exactly.
For me, I think that's the difference between maybe a flash in the pan or someone who's got going through a phase where it's working, that they're focusing more on what they do as opposed to who they are, and doing that work consistently to be the best version of themselves. And as you rightly say, the benefits of that come as a consequence. And
I think it's about being comfortable in yourself as well. And the older you get, I think that comes naturally, doesn't it? But if someone, doesn't like me because of a personality trait that I have, that's fine. If they think, I don't like her, she's a bit noisy, or, she's a bit opinionated, absolutely fine. I've got no problem with that. But I think as long as people can't say they don't like you because you're unkind, or you're, a bully, or you're anything that's really negative that you can control, I think you can't really control if you're a bit noisy or a bit quiet or any of those things, but you can control your manners and how civil you are, and you can be direct, but you can be tactful, and you can be very clear about what you do and don't expect without being unkind as well. And absolutely. I think they're important things to learn.
One of the things that really struck me both while you were on stage, but also as I've learned more about you, is your resilience. Like you're very strong-minded and resilient individual. And you also talked about some of the times that have tested you on stage as well, not least of which the passing of your dad. It would be helpful just to touch on that resilience and how you feel that you've built that resilience over time. And what were the key things that helped you really test that muscle and build the strength on that?
I'm not sure I can take credit for my resilience, because I grew up with quite a tough family where there was no whinging allowed. So I think a lot of it comes from being small. And one of the things about my dad that I didn't talk about was he was actually paraplegic.
Oh, wow.
So he had an accident before I was born, and he fell 40 foot and landed on concrete, didn't die. But he then couldn't really walk properly without a walking stick from when I was about 7. So when I was small, he was in that hospital a lot, having spinal operations. There was a lot of recuperation. There'd be periods of like 2-3 months where we wouldn't see him, and my mum would take us to the hospital to see him. And then when I was 15, he had an operation that went wrong and ended up in a wheelchair. And but he had to go into a home for a while because the house has to be converted. So you've got to have doorways widened and kitchens lowered and stuff. So I was 14 and my brother was, or 14 or 15, so my brother would have been about 12. And my mum and dad were divorced by then, but she would take us to see him in this home. And there were people in there that was really quite disabled. Dad just couldn't walk, but he was perfectly...
otherwise fine.
Otherwise normal. But there were people in there that were really quite disabled. And we would just mix with them and talk to them, and we were taught that it's nothing to be frightened of. So I think a lot of the resilience comes from that stuff when we were kids, and we didn't have a lot of money either. So, and it's testament, I think, to my mum and dad that we weren't aware that we didn't have a lot of money. Yeah. And I think not having a lot of money in the 80s is a bit different to not having a lot of money now, because I think no one had a lot of money in the 80s, really.
Absolutely, where we didn't either.
So I think it just there was an awareness that, my mum was doing her best and she was working full time, and we had to be patient with my dad because he was walking with a stick. So I think a lot of it, that was a very long answer to a short question, but I think a lot of it came from that and being a grown up and being kind of sensitive to situations. And I think that carried through. And then I remember when we found out that my dad was going to be paraplegic, basically, and wasn't going to walk again. And my mum was so matter of fact about it. She said, "This is what's happening. The operation didn't go well. Your dad's not going to walk again. We're not going to make a fuss."
Wow.
So
I'm sensing that some of the strength of you as an individual is definitely coming from your mum also.
Yes. Yeah. And like I felt a bit bad actually, because mum didn't get a mention when I was on stage at Women Estate Agency. But a lot of it, what I was trying to do at Women Estate Agency was really talk about the influence of my dad, because like you said, it's important to bring men into the conversation.
Absolutely.
But yeah, a lot of the resilience came from my mum.
Yeah.
And I think, again, once you've been through something tough and you think, that was all right, and I'm still standing. And again, it becomes cumulative. So something crappy happens, and you get through it and you think, right, and then you think, I've done that.
Yeah.
And it just builds, not a shell, because you still want to be warm and nice.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think the more tough stuff you go through, the tougher you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you realise that nothing is really insurmountable.
Yeah.
And it will pass.
And absolutely, that is without question my favourite expression, this too shall pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we all have to pull upon that at times in our lives. So we're coming to the end of our conversation. Okay. Half an hour really goes very quickly. Wow. So one question that we are going to ask all of our guests on the pod is, why is Women in Estate Agency, the movement, so important to our industry? Why do you think it is?
I think it's important because we are, the slogan is stronger together, and we are. And there's a lot of us coming up now, and I think it's incumbent on the women that have, we're as good as the women that came before us. Yep. So you and I have to be very, very grateful to the women that are all out in their sort of 70s mm-hmm. that fought the fight before us. But it's
maybe haven't seen the benefit of that in their time.
And had a tough time.
Absolutely.
I mean, my mum worked
mm-hmm.
full time in the late 80s and had to get dressed every day and go to London. Mm-hmm. And she couldn't do an online shop on the way to work.
Absolutely.
She had to go food shopping.
No mobile phone.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So she did that so that I can do this.
Yes.
So I think the benefit of the network is for every generation to teach the one coming up behind us that there is a sisterhood and there is solidarity, and this is what we've learned, and this is the benefit of our experience.
Yeah.
And so just to create that network, to make everyone to share and to collaborate and encourage each other to be better. Amazing. And nicer.
Nicer, I like that, because you're absolutely right. You can be better, but not always nicer as well. Yeah. And our final question, we're going to ask all of our guests, who would you like to see on the pod in the future share their story?
I would like to see, it's hard, isn't it? Because there's obviously, I've seen a lot of people, so it's really tricky. Yeah. Who would I like to see? I would like to hear from Claire Hughes, actually, because I don't know very much about Claire, and I think she's probably got a very interesting story.
She sure does. Amazing story, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one for a future episode.
Yes, please.
Danni, thank you so much. Genuinely, thank you for sharing your story with us, and we're honoured that you were able to do so for our very first episode of the pod. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I've been very grateful to be invited.